They said the girl in the gray hoodie was probably lost, a civilian wandering into the wrong hallway of the Ridgemont National Defense Complex. But if they had looked a little closer, just a heartbeat longer, they might have noticed the way she carried herself, the way silence gathered around her like a second uniform, the way even the fluorescent lights seemed to hesitate above her path, unsure whether to flicker or bow. But no one looked, not until it was too late, and that is where everything began, in a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of bleach and disrespect, long before anyone realized who she truly was. And if you're watching this right now and believe no one should be judged by the mop in their hand instead of the life they've lived, make sure to like and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. And before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. Because what happened on that ordinary Thursday morning shook an entire installation to its core. The girl, just 28, soft-spoken, calm, moved quietly along the hallway, her steps steady, her eyes observing everything in that patient way people only earn through years of being underestimated. Her name was Amara Holt, though no one here bothered to ask, least of all Staff Sergeant Kincaid, the kind of man who mistook volume for authority and authority for worth. He spotted her first, leaning over a supply cart with a half-smirk that came too easily to men who'd never learned the weight of silence. And without a second thought, he grabbed a mop from the cart, shoved it toward her chest, and said, "Look alive, janitor. We've got brass coming through, and the floor looks like trash." And the two corporals behind him snickered as if cruelty were currency, and they were rich. Amara didn't correct him. She didn't mention she had woken up before dawn to meet a general. She didn't mention her name was already taped to the folder marked classified sitting on the briefing table 2 floors above. She didn't even mention the rank she carried quietly, tucked not on her clothing, but in the small leather binder in her backpack. The rank she had earned across 5 continents, under 5 different commanders, an operation so buried under ink and secrecy that most people would never know her name. And maybe that's what made her dangerous. Not the stars she didn't wear, but the stars she could have. Instead, she simply nodded once, took the mop, and lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in the way a storm lowers its clouds before revealing what it truly is. Kincaid smirked again, tossing her the bucket as if it weighed nothing, and when she caught it without flinching, his eyebrows lifted slightly, then lowered again beneath the lazy arrogance of someone who'd never had to learn the difference between obedience and restraint. "Keep your head down," he added, as if she needed instruction and humility. "And when the colonels walk by, don't make eye contact. They don't like being stared at by the help." And his voice echoed down the hallway with the hollow confidence of a man who had no idea the person he was talking to outranked everyone he had ever reported to. Amara placed the bucket down, filled it with quiet precision, and began mopping the hallway as ordered, each stroke slow and deliberate, each movement measured, because mopping wasn't beneath her, not because she was meek, but because she understood something none of them did. People reveal their character quickest when they believe you have none. The corporals laughed again as they walked off, already talking about the big briefing happening in Auditorium C, completely unaware that the woman they had just humiliated was the briefing. They disappeared around the corner, their voices fading, but one person didn't laugh. Master Sergeant Warren, old enough to have earned every crease in his uniform, stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that saw not a janitor, not a mistake, not a stranger, but a secret he recognized, even if he wasn't sure why. He stepped forward slowly and said in a low voice, "You don't have to do that, ma'am." But Amara shook her head gently, replying, "Sometimes it's better if they don't know yet." And Warren froze at that single word, "Yet," as if it had opened a door he wasn't supposed to see behind. She finished her work silently, rinsed the mop, straightened the cart, and walked away without taking anything with her except the same quiet dignity she'd brought in, leaving behind a hallway gleaming from her effort and a staff sergeant who would soon wish he had chosen a different kind of manhood that morning. As she walked toward the restricted elevator, security systems waking at her approach, scanners lighting up in soft blue recognition, the entire facility hummed with preparations for the briefing, one they believed would be led by a seasoned intelligence officer in his 40s. No one expected the girl in the hoodie, but the building knew her. The clearance knew her. The retinal scanner blinked green the moment she stepped forward, the steel doors unfolding like a bow, And for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself a breath, steady and calm. The kind of breath you take when you know a truth is about to reveal itself not by force, but by inevitability. And in that brief moment of silence, the narrator in all of this, whoever history chooses to be, would later say that this was where everything shifted, not when she walked into the briefing room, not when the general stood for her, not when the medals earned in silence finally met the eyes of those too loud to listen. No, the shift happened right here in this hallway, when a woman who held the rank of colonel accepted a mob without breaking her pride, because she knew that people who mistake humility for weakness are always the ones who learn the hardest lessons. And within the next hour, everyone in that building would learn exactly who she was. The briefing room was already buzzing when Amara stepped out of the secured elevator 3 floors above the hallway she'd just mopped, though no one inside realized the quiet figure moving down the corridor toward them was the very person they were nervously preparing for. Soldiers typed faster. Officers straightened their collars. Analysts whispered last-minute notes over glowing screens, all waiting for the lead intelligence officer the commander had warned them about. A man, they assumed. Older, seasoned, maybe gray-haired and intimidating. The sort of myth people created because they couldn't imagine brilliance arriving young, or quiet, or wrapped in a woman's frame. Inside Auditorium C, Staff Sergeant Kincaid strutted between rows, barking orders at junior personnel. Get those slides ready. No mistakes today. The colonel will have our hides if we screw this up. Still laughing under his breath about the janitor girl. Completely oblivious that the colonel he feared and the woman he disrespected were the same person, separated only by his own arrogance. The corporals who had mocked her earlier were standing rigidly by the entrance doors, trying to look more professional than they were, whispering about rumors of a cyber operation that had caused 3 agencies to scramble overnight. One of them joked that the incoming officer probably had battle scars and a bad attitude, and they all snickered, unaware that the real battle scars were the kind you couldn't see, the kind a 28-year-old carried quietly through classified corridors, while the world underestimated her at every turn. The commander, General Rain, stood at the podium reviewing his opening remarks, his fingers tapping the edges of the folder marked Holt, classified level 6, and every few seconds he checked the clock, waiting. She should be here by now, he murmured, and Kincaid, overhearing, scoffed to the officers beside him. Probably some hardliner who makes people cry. We'll be fine. But then the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens when hierarchy recognizes someone of higher gravity, when a presence enters a space and it remembers the rules it forgot it had. The double doors at the back of the auditorium opened without a sound. No announcement. No fanfare. Just silence rolling in like a tide. General Rain straightened instantly, spine rigid, chin lifted. Every officer in the first 3 rows rose to their feet in perfect unison, chairs scraping back, heads bowing. Not to Kincaid, not to any imagined colonel, but to the woman walking through the doorway with the calm certainty of someone who had stood in rooms far more dangerous than this. Amara Holt stepped inside, her uniform crisp, her rank insignia gleaming faintly under the auditorium lights, her expression steady and unreadable. The corporals at the doors froze like statues, their mouths dropping open so sharply it was almost audible. Kincaid's face drained of color as though someone had pulled the floor out from under him, and he stumbled back a step, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and horror. That's the Jan," he whispered, but the word died in his throat as the master sergeant from earlier appeared behind him and hissed. "That's Colonel Holt, you fool. Youngest one in the division." Amara didn't look at them. She walked with quiet authority past the rows of uniforms, past analysts and officers who now stood rigidly at attention, and approached the podium where General Rain saluted her with the sharp respect of a man who knew exactly what she'd sacrificed for her rank. "Colonel Holt," he said formally, "the floor is yours." She returned the salute, took her place at the center of the room, and began speaking, not with the loud aggression they expected, but with the precise, measured control of someone who had spent years turning chaos into order. The screen behind her flickered to life with encrypted diagrams and intelligence reports, and she began laying out a sensitive threat assessment that left the room hanging on every syllable. Her voice cut cleanly through the air, confident and direct, outlining digital infiltration patterns, foreign data channels, and the timeline of events that had triggered today's briefing, none of which the man who mocked her would ever have comprehended even if she had drawn it in crayons. Kincaid tried to steady himself, tried to swallow the humiliation rising like bile in his chest, but each sentence she spoke carved the truth deeper into him. He hadn't just misjudged her. He had exposed the limits of his own leadership. The corporals avoided looking at her altogether, their posture stiffening with regret and fear as the realization washed over them in waves. They had shoved a mop into the hands of one of the most influential intelligence officers in the building. And still, Amaran never acknowledged them. Not a glance. Not a flicker. Her professionalism was a mirror they could not hide from, reflecting their own smallness back at them. She moved through the material with a calm mastery that held the room captive, making even the seasoned analysts feel like students. After nearly an hour, she paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The room went still. Then, very slowly, she turned her head, not toward the generals, not toward the analysts, but toward the sergeant who had mocked her in the hallway that morning. Her gaze was steady, unreadable, devoid of anger or pettiness, but full of something far heavier, truth. And in that moment, every person in the auditorium felt the realization click into place, that there are lessons in life that arrive quietly, not as punishment, but as consequence, and the next words Amara Holt spoke would change everything that followed. For a long, heavy moment, Amara let the room sit in the silence she'd earned, the kind of silence that didn't demand authority but revealed it. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the steady gravity of someone who understood exactly what power was and what it wasn't. "Before we proceed to phase 2, she said, eyes still on Kincaid, "there's something we need to address." Her tone was not sharp, not cruel, not triumphant. It was calmer than the stillness before a storm, and somehow sharper for it. Every officer in the room stiffened as she continued. "This morning, in this building, individuals assigned to uphold the standards of this institution failed to demonstrate the most basic one: respect. No names, no theatrics, just truth laid bare with surgical precision." The corporals blanched, Kincaid's breathing faltered, and even the analysts lowered their eyes as if they were witnessing a lesson carved into the bones of the room. "Rank is irrelevant," she went on. "Clearance is irrelevant. Uniforms are irrelevant. Respect," she said, her voice deepening just slightly, "is the foundation of discipline. And discipline is the first line of defense in national security." The words hit like quiet artillery. No explosion, just impact. General Rain watched her with a solemn expression, then stepped forward as if giving her space to decide just how far this reckoning would go. But Amara didn't demand punishment. She didn't need to. "I am not here for apologies," she continued, turning back toward the briefing material. "I'm here to ensure that everyone in this room understands the gravity of their roles. If you cannot recognize dignity," her gaze flicked to Kincaid once more, "you cannot recognize threats." And that was it. No dramatic pause. No vindictive glare. Just a final, precise truth dropped into the silence like a stone into water, its ripples destined to reach every corner of their careers. General Rain stepped to the front then, his voice colder than the metal at his collar. "Sergeant Kincaid, Corporals Hayes and Danner." Their names cracked across the room like a verdict. "You are immediately relieved of briefing assistance duties. Report to disciplinary review at 1600. The corporals swallowed hard, their faces ashen, but Kincaid's shoulders sagged like a man whose entire posture had finally learned the weight of humility. They didn't argue. They didn't speak. They simply nodded and stepped back as if retreating from a truth that had swallowed them whole. Master Sergeant Warren watched from the side, a faint, knowing smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, not triumphant, but proud, as if he'd known all along that silence was never weakness in the hands of the right person. Amara returned to the briefing with perfect composure, finishing her assessment with the efficiency of someone who could compartmentalize anything, even cruelty that wasn't hers. And when the last slide faded, when the room exhaled collectively, General Rain dismissed the assembly with a stern warning about conduct, professionalism, and the consequences of forgetting what leadership actually looked like. But the true ending didn't happen on the stage. It happened in the corridor afterward, the same one she had mopped just hours before. When Amara stepped through the doorway and found every soldier standing at attention lining the hall, their backs straight, their chins lifted, a line of wordless apology and reverence stretching all the way to the elevator. She didn't slow. She didn't soak in their remorse. She simply walked forward, her footsteps echoing against the tile she had polished herself that morning. Each step a quiet reminder that dignity doesn't raise its voice to be heard. It rises. At the end of the hall, Master Sergeant Warren waited, offering her a small, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said simply. She returned it, a hint of warmth touching her eyes. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, shutting out the stares and whispers and the lingering sting of humiliation transformed into awe, the narrator of this story, whoever history decides that is, would later say that no part of her rise that day came from rank alone. It came from restraint, from character, from the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself to be undeniable. Because they forced her to mop the floor in the morning. But by afternoon, she walked out the highest-ranking officer in the building, and every person who had ignored her learned the cost of underestimating the quietest one in the room.